Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Wale and I are going to come up stage in a moment, but first of all, we're going to preview the first 10 minutes of a fantastic podcast produced by The Republic that tells the story of the brave activism of the Ogoni Nine in the 1990s who fought against mineral extractivism and the brutal dictatorship of General Sani Abacha. So we'll listen to that for the first 10 minutes, and then Wale and I will come up here and have a conversation. So please enjoy, and be sure to scan the QR code at the end, and make sure you listen to the rest of the podcast whenever you find a moment afterwards. Thank you. See you soon.
That was the time we began to talk about Nadeco route, exit route. Everybody knew how you can escape from Nigeria through Igboho or through Badagry. You can't check his ability for corruption. You cannot check it. He was the arrowhead of corruption. Even the money he stole, we have not recovered all of them. And each time they release them incrementally, I usually make the joke, we thank our God in heaven for sending us some money. And Nigeria became isolated internationally.
I summarized those days, those times. I said it was a terrible time to be alive. I know I was kind of exaggerating, but you have to exaggerate if you want to capture the essence of some things. And that was the only way I could think of it. It was a terrible time to be alive for so many reasons. And if you've read my first novel, you will understand exactly, because it's set in that milieu, the 1990s in Nigeria. And if I can think of one thing that epitomizes for me the whole Sani Abacha years, it would be the killing of Ken Saro-Wiwa, which is very relevant to what we're talking about now. When a dictator decided to throw aside all the norms that govern modern society, the rule of law and all these things, and just hanged Ken Saro-Wiwa, taking him through the process of some kangaroo justice, and hanged him just because he was protesting the environmental injustices that were happening in the Niger Delta. So for me, that summarizes the Sani Abacha years. So there's total disregard for human rights, total disregard for democracy, democratic norms, total disregard for what the world thought about Nigeria, because we were kicked out of the Commonwealth of Nations.
One of the worst things happened to Nigeria.
And one of the things that made us realize how brutal Abacha could be was how he handled the Ogoni crisis as compared to how Babangida handled it. There's this conversation that if what had happened during Babangida's time, would Ken Saro-Wiwa still be alive still today? It's debatable, but those conversations have been had,
At the time, we are always hoping for the best for Nigeria. And whoever comes in, whether military or just civilian, you just think, okay, try for us, And we'd been through an era in the 80s where it was just coup after coup after coup. So we were thinking maybe a little bit of stability here with this man Abacha. But he was different in that he went after the press, which was just a surprise. His rule did not seem logical. And in visiting Port Harcourt, where I'd go straight away, because that's where my family were, I noticed that on the Aba Road towards the university campus, Port Harcourt University campus, someone who was a little challenged had painted words on walls, lampposts, huts, trash or whatever, but it was perfect text because he was obviously someone that had a breakdown of some kind, and he did perfect graffiti, and it seemed like such a rebellious statement to the government at the time, because they were cutting what people could say. They were cutting down on our freedoms. And this person who was having a breakdown just covered the street in words that went on for miles, and I just thought visually that was exciting for me, thinking, well, this man obviously doesn't care and is trying to embrace the freedoms that one can have in one's own country, and that is to speak out with letters. So at the time in Nigeria, there was fear and repression and little outbursts from people, even madmen, that I saw as an artist.
You're probably wondering why we chose to start this season talking about General Sani Abacha, the despot who ruled Nigeria from 1993 until his mysterious death in 1998. The short answer is this: if we really want to understand what Ken Saro-Wiwa, the protagonist of our story this season, was up against, we have to understand Abacha. What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? During much of Abacha's regime, this was the dynamic between Abacha and Saro-Wiwa. But at one point, Abacha seemed to give way, to extend an olive branch. In 1994, around 2 months into his rule, he invited Saro-Wiwa to become Nigeria's oil minister. Can you guess Saro-Wiwa's response?
You remember a recent joke when the Haskan activist appointed into the Buhari government that you used to be an activist. What is happening? And he said, you don't talk when you are eating, that you're already chopping.
Abacha's decision wasn't random, and when it came to politics or government work, Saro-Wiwa was no tyro. We will talk a bit more about Saro-Wiwa's political career. For now though, one interesting thing that came up during my research for this podcast is that Abacha and Saro-Wiwa were actually quite close. According to Saro-Wiwa's son, Ken Jr., at some point, they were even neighbors and lived in Port Harcourt in a neighborhood called Nzimiro Street. Earlier this year, when I visited Port Harcourt, I went to Nzimiro Street. It's a stately street. In his memoir, In the Shadow of a Saint, Ken Jr. explains that in the 70s, the area around Nzimiro Street was known as Amadi Flats. I'm going to read how Ken Jr. described it. Amadi Flats was an exclusive area that housed the families of expats, army officers, wealthy businessmen, and government officials. As a commissioner in the state government, my father enjoyed the privileges of office: a chauffeur-driven Mercedes, the house, and a pampered lifestyle with servants. Despite the many years that have passed since the Saro-Wiwas lived on Nzimiro Street, I definitely got the vibe Ken Jr. described when I visited. The Saro-Wiwa family lived at number 11. The house I met there was a blue mansion with the prominent front pillars typical of Nigerian stately architecture. A Google Maps Street View search I did later suggested the building was under some construction as of January 2020. Ken Jr. described their building as a colonial mansion in the middle of the city. I saw several mansions on that street that fit his description. He also recalled playing as a child with a kid named Ibrahim who lived next door at number 9. The building I found next to number 11 was a high-security military residence coated in red and gold. Later, Ken Jr. would reveal that Ibrahim was Abacha's son.
People also tend to forget that Ken Saro-Wiwa and General Sani Abacha used to be very close. In fact, their houses in Port Harcourt were not far away from one another. But their backgrounds were very different. Saro-Wiwa, a writer, producer, call him an intellectual. Abacha was not.
Visiting Nzimiro Street, learning how close Abacha and Saro-Wiwa were, I had questions. What happened to that relationship? How did their story evolve from one of friendly neighbors to the slippery tale of a ministerial offer and to the harrowing story of an unlawful, brutal execution? Hello and welcome to The Republic, a podcast about pivotal African figures and historical events. I'm your host, Wale Lawal. In 7 episodes, I'm going to walk you through one of the biggest miscarriages of justice in Nigeria's history, the Abacha regime's execution of the Ogoni 9 in 1995. To experience what happened, we'll explore the life and legacy of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the significance of the Ogoni struggle against oil companies and their environmental degradation of the Niger Delta. Episode 1: Abacha's Offer. To understand the significance of Abacha's ministerial offer to Saro-Wiwa, we first need to realize where Nigeria was in the 90s. We had just emerged from the 80s, where a structural adjustment program the IMF recommended had put us in a deep economic crisis. Our real GDP was falling by 2.5% annually in the early 1990s. Unemployment levels had reached 3.5 million, and foreign debt had increased to $30 billion. At the outset of the 90s, all Nigerians could see were perilous times.
Like many Nigerians, I've felt frustrated and saddened by what has happened to us. We've had our independence for more than 20 years. By third world standards, we have a well-educated elite. We had a productive farming economy. We have minerals. And we discovered a few years ago that we had oil, a lot of oil. Yet today we're importing food that we should be growing. We are a bankrupt nation, and we have an international reputation for large-scale corruption. Many of our people are unhappy, and some even hungry. What has gone wrong?
The voice you've just heard is a young Onyeka Onwenu, the celebrated musician who passed away earlier this year. In 1984, when the NTA BBC documentary she featured in came out, Onyeka was a broadcaster gifted at communicating the feelings of everyday Nigerians. Like Onyeka, throughout our modern history, Nigerians have often found themselves asking, what has gone wrong? And she was right to ask. In the 80s, the Nigerian economy was majorly dependent on oil revenue, crippled by debt and grappling with plummeting exchange rates. According to the Central Bank of Nigeria, over 97% of Nigeria's export revenue came from oil. Nigeria had racked up 56.6% of its GDP in public debt. And between 1984 and 1993, the Naira's value against the dollar would fall from $1 to 76 kobo to $1 to 22 Naira. Things would get so bad that a 1990 opinion piece from the New York Times led with the headline, "In Nigeria, Voiceless Victims of Debt." Sound familiar?
God, I beg. God, I beg.
In our first season, we talked about how Nigeria failed to transition to a civilian government in 1993 after the head of state, General Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida, aka IBB, annulled the June 12 presidential election. Shortly after, IBB created an interim government led by Chief Ernest Shonekan. We also talked about how Shonekan's government was unpopular and was quickly deposed by General Abacha in a bloodless coup. On becoming head of state, Abacha immediately annulled the 1989 constitution, which paved the way for the 1993 presidential election. In 1994, when presidential candidate and rumored winner Moshood Kashimao Olawale Abiola proclaimed himself president of Nigeria, Abacha had him arrested. That same year, Abacha instituted 2 decrees that gave his government absolute power. The decrees placed his government above the courts and gave his government the right to detain anyone without trial for up to 3 months. A New York Times article from September 1994 titled, "Nigerian Military Ruler Assumes Absolute Power," suggested the decrees were not well received. The article said, and I'm going to quote this, "Democracy advocates responded to General Abacha's decrees with frustration. They unfold an era in which no Nigerian is sure of his or her freedom or sanctity of life," said Gani Fawemi, a lawyer who is defending dozens of jailed dissidents. General Abacha closed 3 newspaper and magazine groups, including the most influential and respected in the country, The Guardian of Lagos. The others are Concord, which Mr. Abiola owns, and Punch. End quote. The Abacha government had to deal with the ongoing Ogoni crisis, which IBB and Shonekan had failed to manage. As part of his efforts to repress dissent in the Niger Delta, and with oil increasingly important to his regime, in 1994, Abacha established the River State Inland Security, a notorious force that would leave nightmares in Ogoni land for decades to come. But how did we get here? The short answer is crude oil. And the story goes as far back as the 1930s, when Nigeria was a British colony. Britain was broke after the First World War and needed money, so it sought more ways of extracting wealth from its colonies. In Nigeria, the British colonial government gave licenses to a consortium of 2 oil companies, British Petroleum and Shell Darcy, aka Shell. The colonial licenses allowed these companies to start looking for crude oil, an increasingly valuable commodity in international markets.
Oil is sort of slow, even though it's discovered and they begin to do exploration and there was commerce around it. It really wasn't until wars in the 20th century that great powers began to see the significance of it. And that really started late in World War I, because technology changed so much in World War I, and they needed oil for lots of the transportation. It was the first time countries were trying to extend its influence and send its soldiers so far. So gradually in World War I, they started seeing the need for oil, and then particularly the British Navy decided to shift from coal powering its ships to oil. With the end of World War I and following that, and certainly by World War II, there becomes a great interest in oil, supplies of oil, and it really being the fuel that was in the engine of the industrial development then.
BP and Shell had already found oil in Eket, a community in present-day Akwa Ibom State in southern Nigeria. But considering the high costs of oil extraction, the oil they found was not commercially viable. Later in this season, we'll talk about the economics of oil, but for now, just know that when the volume of oil is high enough and can give companies a profit after extraction, they say the oil is of commercial quantity. Decades later, in 1956, Shell discovered oil of commercial quantity in Oloibiri, a community in present-day Bayelsa State, about 420 kilometers west of Eket. I should note here that the location of the first discovery of crude oil in Nigeria is still a debated subject. Some historians have argued that Otu-Agbagi in Bayelsa was the first site for crude oil discovery, which is 9.5 kilometers from Oloibiri. What we do know for sure is that over time, more oil wells were found in Afam, 150 kilometers east of Oloibiri, and Bomu, 190 kilometers east of Oloibiri, in Ogoni. This initial discovery sparked hope among many Nigerians as we approached our independence.
The happiness become ogele when we do. Then the cell say they go make this our place to be like where they come from, London. The elders of this community that time, na big ogele. We take so we go see that well one.
By now, the colonial government had given oil licenses to a few other oil companies to operate in Nigeria. These included 3 American companies, Mobil in 1955, Tenneco in 1960, and Gulf Oil, which we now know as Chevron, in 1961. Agip, an Italian company, also got a license in 1962. Of all these firms, Shell seemed to have the lion's share of oil opportunities. When I spoke to historian Professor Toyin Falola, he explained that
the British imposed a series of regulations on shipping, on foreign reserves, on the military, on security, including a dominant concession to Shell. In other words, they said, without even knowing the quantity of that oil, they gave an extensive concession rights to Shell and some other oil companies. So that by the time we knew this extensive nature, that contract was already in place.
the continued explorations across southern Nigeria led up to the oil boom of the 1970s. Nigeria became incredibly rich from its oil exports, even in the immediate aftermath of the Nigerian Civil War, which ran from 1967 to 1970. Nigeria's coffers were overflowing.
Nigeria, the first international war in Africa, they ran that war without getting broke. War is supposed to get you broke. Europe has not fully survived from the damages of the Second World War, the crashes to the economy and the crashes to their global power, the rise of the Soviet Union and the rise of the US. Nigeria survived that. They didn't have to borrow money.
Nigeria had a lot of money, and the chief beneficiary of Nigeria's oil boom was its growing middle class.
By 1973, which was the peak of the creation of the Nigerian middle class, that money was such that education was available. The people you now call middle class, like school teachers and nurses, could buy cars. Volkswagen was 1,300 naira. And Gowon declared a statement that he later regretted. Nigeria does not have problems of money. It is what to do with it that is the issue.
In the 1970s, the Nigerian military government under General Yakubu Gowon made the move to nationalize oil production through the indigenization decree. The Nigerian National Oil Corporation, NNOC, was established in 1971 by the Nigerian government, and it aimed to oversee the development and regulation of the petroleum industry. It was the first attempt by Nigeria to actively participate in the oil industry. By 1977, NNOC merged with the Federal Ministry of Mines and Power and became the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, NNPC, which we are more familiar with today. This led to a series of joint ventures between the government and oil companies, ensuring that the government held over 50% of the ventures. Now that was a lot. So let's pause here for a second. The indigenization degree is an essential part of this story, but it's pretty technical. So I asked Funbi Akinsoya, who wrote this episode with me, to help unpack what the indigenization decree entailed. Over to you, Funbi.
So the indigenization decree of 1972 was developed to help Nigeria achieve economic independence. 12 years post-independence, many foreign firms were operating in Nigeria and making a lot of money, with next to no Nigerian beneficiaries. Gowon saw this and thought, what if we transfer ownership of foreign investments and industries to Nigerians? When you think about it, the logic was strategic. Nigerians would be employed and productive, plus richer, and who knows, maybe they might even like the military government. Populism 101. By 1977, this decree was expanded to 3 major schedules. Schedule 1 mandated certain types of companies like fashion houses must be 100% owned by Nigerians. Schedule 2 required that Nigerians must have at least 60% of majority ownership and applied to banks. Schedule 3 stated that Nigerians must have at least 40% of ownership in businesses like breweries. Hope this helps. Back to you, Wale.
Thanks, Funbi. Chimeka Garrix is a lawyer and the author of the 2004 novel Tomorrow Died Yesterday, a modern classic about oil in the Niger Delta. When I spoke to him about the Niger Delta, he made an interesting point about how the military government also used policies like the Land Use Act to strategically annex all of Nigeria's resources, becoming the owners while everyone else became renters.
The Nigerian constitution, even right from time, all the military constitutions that were there, they vest all control of oil resources in the federal government. The Nigerian Land Use Act, which was enacted in 1978, vests control of all land in government, state governments. So basically, in Nigeria, what you own is a certificate of occupancy. What the government gives you a right to lease. It's just like a lease of the land.
Owning all land resources automatically gave the government oversight into critical industries like the oil industry. You'd think this would enable the government to ensure that oil companies followed its regulations. In an ideal world, that would be the case. But Nigeria in the 70s, under military control, was far from ideal. Often, when we talk about international oil companies, or IOCs, as most people in the industry call them, there's an inherent paradox. Earlier, I mentioned that the indigenization decree is an essential part of the story. That's because in Nigeria, at least, IOCs can even be more Nigerian than they are international. Chimeka explained this better.
What most people don't understand is that the Nigerian government owns majority stakes in most of the oil companies. I think in most of the oil joint venture companies, Nigerian government owns up to 60%. In SPDC, I think it's about 55% of the joint ventures. So when you are saying, is this company, in many ways, it is actually your government.
Chimeka Garrix's comments made me think about the levels of government collusion and corruption Nigeria's oil industry has faced over the years. Even today, there are still prominent scandals which show our very persistent institutional issues. Just look at the recently closed P&ID case. For over a decade, Nigeria and the Irish engineering company had been in a legal battle. P&ID claimed Nigeria had failed to honor a gas supply and processing agreement and asked for damages worth $11.5 billion, a figure that could nearly bankrupt Nigeria. For context, as of 2023, the height of the legal battle, Nigeria had less than $33 billion in its reserves. We only escaped because, according to Premium Times, in 2023, London's High Court ruled that P&ID got the contract after paying bribes to senior officials of the Petroleum Ministry. Whew, Abi?
We begin with reactions of Nigeria's landmark victory against Process and Industrial Development Limited. President Bola Tinubu has applauded the judgment of Judge Robin Knowles of the Business and Property Court in London for prioritizing the merits of the case above all other considerations. The president also noted that the victory is not for Nigeria alone, but for Africa and the developing world at large. Judge Knowles dismissed the $11.5 billion value of the award and accumulated interest previously won by P&ID over a failed 2010 deal to allegedly build a gas processing plant on the grounds that the award was obtained by fraud.
What about the recent saga between Dangote Refineries, NNPC, and the Nigerian government? Here's Aliko Dangote himself on his experience with what he called the oil mafia.
I knew that there would be a fight, but I didn't know that, the mafia in oil, they are stronger than mafia in drugs.
Through the 70s and the 80s, Nigeria continued to thrive at extracting and exporting crude oil. But as Nigeria's government focused its efforts on crude oil, agricultural exports of cash crops fell tremendously and gradually became disregarded entirely for black gold.
The truth of the matter is that 3-4 years ago, he would have built that house for approximately 100,000 naira. He will get 50,000 naira by way of rent in a year, and he will get a minimum 4 or 5 years rent in advance. So with the first lot of payment, it's clear this, loans and advances, is paid the interest on it, and it's still, substantially in hand. He can start another house, or he can buy himself, a holiday house in Knightsbridge. This is it's typical.
Contrary to Gowon's promise that indigenization would spread wealth to everyday Nigerians, Nigeria's oil wealth was only shared amongst a select few, basically government officials and political elites, while those who lived in the oil-rich regions were left impoverished. Oil, which seemed to have promised prosperity for all, quickly became a blessing for a select few and a curse for the masses. The novelist Helen Habila wrote the 2010 novel Oil on Water, which has been described as a work of petrofiction, the literary genre that explores the interactions between oil, humanity, and society. When I spoke to Helen Habila about how these three things interact in Nigeria, he explained that
whenever there's big money, there's always going to be corruption, and it starts from different levels, from the politicians who collude with the oil companies to rape the environment and the people, and kind of perverting the sensibility of the people, the morality, if you like, of the community.
Without proper systems in place, the discovery of crude oil led to a gradual degradation of the environment within Niger Delta. But crude oil did not act alone. Oil extraction quickly became synonymous with operational negligence without any compensation to locals who lost their livelihoods as a result of the environmental harms. Professor Falola put this in stronger words.
That oil became blood money.
Not surprisingly, from the 1970s into the 1990s, there was rising discontent within the Niger Delta. Members of Niger Delta communities made several attempts for dialogue with the government. They reached out to both the military government and the brief Shehu Shagari civilian government to address the environmental issues they faced, but their attempts were ignored. To them, the government's interests were more aligned with the interests of oil companies than with those of the people who actually lived in the oil-producing communities and had been suffering the consequences of underregulated oil extraction. According to Helen Habila,
this, of course, is about the environment. It's about oil. These are international issues. These are issues that know no boundaries. It's about multinational corporations trying to make profit of poor people, of African countries, just because they want to fill their pockets with billions and billions of dollars. Even if they destroy the environment in the process, they don't care about it.
By the 1990s, oil became the majority revenue source for Nigeria. About 90% of oil export revenue came from oil, according to the Central Bank of Nigeria. Yet, the 1990s were far from the makeshift prosperity of the 70s and underperformed even compared to the 80s. In the last season, we explained how, with the annulment of the election in 1993, Nigeria found itself in political flux. IBB, the military ruler from 1985 to 1993, left office, delegating power to Chief Shonekon to form an interim government. But Shonekon's government struggled to contain the economic crisis left over from the 80s and the widespread resentment Nigerians had following the controversial June 12 election. The Niger Delta especially was at a boiling point. Communities began changing tactics from seeking dialogue with the government to taking to the streets to protest the continuous degradation of their environment and living conditions. In the midst of these failings, Abacha, who was serving as the Minister of Defense, saw an opportunity not only to seize power, but also to consolidate Nigeria's wealth. And what is greed, if not a beast?
work with a government, a military regime like Sani Abacha's that doesn't care about its people, doesn't care about development, has no vision whatsoever, and will ruthlessly maintain its power.
Abacha was the kind of guy who was a dictator's dictator. He took being a dictator seriously.
So who was General Sani Abacha? Sani Abacha was born on September 20, 1943 in Kano State, Nigeria, to Kanuri parents. His early education was also in Kano. After independence, Abacha joined the Nigerian Military Training College in Kaduna. In 1963, he was commissioned as second lieutenant after he attended Mons Defense Officers Cadet Training College in Aldershot, England. He fought in the Civil War, where he served as a platoon and battalion commander. By 1969, he had risen in rank to major. After the war, according to his obituary in the New York Times, Abacha continued his military training in the UK and in the US in Monterey, California. By 1983, he had become brigadier and was appointed to Nigeria's Supreme Military Council in the same year. He became more visible in the political space as he supported the coup to overthrow Shagari. In fact, he announced the coup that toppled the Shagari government in 1983. That was Abacha's first introduction to the Nigerian public and international community. The 1983 coup ushered in General Muhammadu Buhari as head of state. Under the Buhari government, Abacha became the general commanding officer of the 2nd Mechanized Division. 2 years later, after IBB deposed Buhari in a coup, Abacha served as Chief of Army Staff, a role he held until 1990. Then he became Chief of Defense Staff, which IBB turned into Minister of Defense, a position Abacha held until 1993, when he led his own coup against the Shonekan government on November 17. By the time Abacha took over, he was a consummate military man who had been part of 3 military coups between 1983 and 1993. He was considered very diligent and showed a borderline obsessive interest in power. After all, he was the first military head of state to have attained full military rank of general without skipping a single rank. He seemed to have been quietly biding his time to seize power.
The state executive councils are dissolved. The brigade commanders are to take over from the governors in their states until administrators are appointed. Where there are no brigade commanders, the commissioners of police in the states are to take over. All local governments stand dissolved. The directors of personnel are to take over the administration of the local governments until administrators are appointed.
With his ascension to power, Abacha made promises of ensuring a constitutional reform and smooth transition to civilian rule.
The Constitutional Conference will also recommend the method of forming parties, which will lead to the ultimate recognition of political parties formed by the people. While the conference is on, the reorganization and reform of the following major institutions will be carried out: the military, the police, the customs, the judiciary, NITEL, NNPC, NEPA, the banking industry, and our higher institutions of learning.
Even MKO Abiola had faith that Abacha would give him back the presidential mandate he had won a few months earlier. Faith Abacha soon squashed.
Curiously, Abiola also trusted him to some degree, because the way Abiola was reading the situation was that Abacha would hand over power to him, which he did not do. A kind of miscalculation.
On the surface, Abacha seemed to have the interest of Nigeria at heart in his first few weeks, but Nigeria quickly came to know his cruel iron hand. Under the Abacha regime, if you didn't play ball for the carrot, you were often hit hard with the stick to maintain his desired order. Civil society organizations like the National Democratic Coalition, NADECO, and publications like The Guardian were often under threat as they actively spoke out against the Abacha regime and questioned the legitimacy of his government. Many of his opponents found themselves imprisoned, exiled. Many ended up dead.
He engaged in political repression and human rights. I was in the US then. People were afraid of him. Even when you are speaking on phone, your family members will be warning you, don't talk about Abacha. All oppositions, he killed them. very, very, very draconian, immediate censorship, closing newspaper offices, arresting editors, and many fled.
In July 1994, the National Union of Petroleum and Natural Gas Workers, NUPENG, followed by the Petroleum and Natural Gas Senior Staff Association of Nigeria, called for a strike protesting Abiola's arrest and the deteriorating conditions in the oil industry. The Nigerian Labour Congress also joined the strike. This had a profound impact on the Nigerian economy as the nation was at a standstill. According to a 1995 article published in the Africa Fund, the strike shut down Nigeria's crude oil production by 20%. In response, Abacha demanded the removal of the leaders of these unions, such as Frank Kokori, the General Secretary of NUPENG, and had them arrested without trial.
This regime will be firm, humane, and decisive. We will not condone nor tolerate any act of indiscipline. Any attempt to test our will be decisively dealt with.
In 1995, the Washington Post aptly captured the Nigerian experience with an article titled, "Nigeria Suffers in Silence." When Abacha took over, he inherited a Nigeria on its knees. His government oversaw an economy spiraling as a result of international backlash. The backlash included economic sanctions following the annulment of the June 12, 1993 election. His government also faced growing domestic dissatisfaction, especially as the Ogoni crisis became even more prominent. Crude oil is an international commodity, so what was happening in Nigeria wasn't entirely local, but what was happening in the global oil markets. Fumbi, can you give us a rundown?
Yes, I can. At the time, global crude oil prices had fallen considerably because of the Gulf War. The Gulf War was waged by a coalition of over 30 countries led by the United States against Iraq in response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. The war ran from August 1990 to February 1991. Compared to an average of $20 per barrel as of 1989, in 1993, crude oil sold for an average of $17 per barrel. So for the Abacha regime, it was important that the prices didn't fall further.
Thanks, Fumbi. Agitations in the South-South region had been happening throughout the year. In January of 1993, for instance, the Ogoni held a peaceful protest against Shell. This was one of the largest protests led by a minority group in the country, and not surprisingly, it gained both national and international interest. This was also significant because the United Nations had designated 1993 as the International Year of the World's Indigenous People. By June 1993, Shell had stopped all operations in the Ogoni region, and this raised concerns for the Abacha regime as oil was the major source of government revenue and Shell was one of the largest companies in the oil industry.
The Niger Delta is oil-rich, inexhaustible wealth that the military under Abacha did not want to lose. They were thinking that revenues would decline if they left them alone, so they needed to kill the opposition forces. And that economic interest was overriding.
To squash the unrest, Abacha created the RSIS State Security Force in early 1994. RSIS was meant to serve as a buffer between oil companies and the local community, to maintain law and order under the leadership of Major Paul Okuntimo, who served as the commander of the RSIS unit, and Lieutenant Colonel Dauda Musa Komo, who served as the Rivers State Administrator. By 1994, RSIS became terrorists towards the Ogonis and other minority groups. RSIS officers often colluded with both the government and oil companies like Shell to hold the line, intimidate and terrorize the Ogonis. According to Ogoni TV and a 1995 article in The Independent titled "Nigerian Dissident Faces Death Penalty," Okuntimo was renowned for boasting about the 213 ways the Ogonis could be killed. Many in the oil-rich Ogoni communities spoke out against the environmental and economic damages oil extraction was causing. By 1993, these voices had become united by a non-violent organization Sariwa-led called the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, MOSUP. And feeling isolated from the wider Nigerian political forum, many Ogonis had boycotted the June 12, 1993 election, voicing their belief that Nigeria did not fairly represent them or their interests. Organized, the Ogonis would not easily back down. Hungry for oil wealth, the Abacha regime only became more furious. The situation was tense. But against this backdrop, the Ogonis were also dealing with local conflicts, such as with the Andoni people, in which the military had intervened. According to Sariwa's brother, Dr. Owens Wiwa, who the journalist J. Timothy Hunt quotes in his book, The Politics of Bones, some Ogoni fishermen had gone missing, which led to an inter-ethnic conflict between the Ogoni and Andoni in 1993. By September 1993, an Ogoni-Andoni peace accord had been signed, yet tension continued. For Sariwa, restitution and justice for the Ogoni were the priorities. He had made plans to visit his family in London after his son Tedum died following a heart-related illness. But according to his son Ken Jr., Sariwa remained hyper-focused on the Ogoni struggle. In Ken Jr.'s memoir, Ken Jr. writes, "When he came to London, we immediately locked horns when I pointedly refused to talk about the struggle. I reminded him that the bills for Tedum's funeral still hadn't been paid and that his son's grave did not have a headstone. Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. I shook my head in disbelief. He stayed long enough to honor our commitment to plant a tree at the spot where Tedum had died. Sariwa returned to Nigeria sometime between late November 1993 and early January of 1994. In Nigeria, he had a meeting with Abacha to discuss the military's involvement in the Ogoni-Andoni conflict, which Abacha denied being involved in. According to Ken Jr., this sparked a discussion between Sariwa and Abacha about the state of the Ogoni struggle. During that discussion, Abacha asked Sariwa to become Nigeria's Minister of Oil, a strategy Abacha said he hoped would ease tensions. How did Sariwa respond to the offer? Well, it was an unequivocal no. According to Ken Jr.'s memoir, Sariwa's exact words were, "The Ogoni struggle was about justice for the community, not political appointments for individuals." After the meeting with Abacha, Sariwa felt optimistic, like he had tasted some victory. According to Ken Jr.'s memoir, Ken Sariwa, the eternal optimist, came away from the meeting in a buoyant mood. Friends warned him about Abacha, but he genuinely felt, or maybe he just hoped, that he had won over the taciturn little general. Ken Jr. wrote, he declared that Abacha was sympathetic to the Ogoni cause, but the two men might as well have been speaking different languages. What my father didn't know was that Abacha was already planning his coup. While my father left with a positive impression of Abacha, the general quietly marked his cards. Unknown to Sariwa, his rejection of Abacha's offer made him public enemy number one. And as Abacha committed in his takeover speech, he was ready to deal swiftly and brutally with any form of indiscipline.
There is nothing very strange in disappointment because it's the politics of co-option. You can't become a minister of oil and still be active. That's not going to, you have to take one. You can't be an environmental activist, a minister, and be attacking Shell. That's not going to work. You can't say, we put a whole ministry in your charge, the management of the Niger Delta, the supervision of Shell, and become a critic.
At the start of this episode, I mentioned that Abacha and Sariwa were once neighbors, that their sons were even friends. In The Politics of Bones by J. Timothy Hunt, Dr. Owens Wiwa explains a bit more about Abacha and Sariwa's relationship. He also discusses how the foundation of this relationship was Sariwa's career in government. We discuss this more in the next episode, but for now, in The Politics of Bones, Dr. Owens Wiwa says, Ken maintained good relationships with officers in the Nigerian army. As administrator of Bonny Island, he had needed military cooperation to aid Ogoni refugees and to see that relief such as food and clothing could get to Ogoni land. Ken kept up these important relationships by throwing regular parties at number 11 in Zimiro Street. One evening's guest list included the commander of the Nigerian Army Engineering Corps, Olusegun Obasanjo, the Army Chief of Staff under Murtala Mohammed, General T.Y. Danjuma, and Ken's next-door neighbor, a short, quiet soldier named Sani Abacha. Until that meeting with Abacha, Sariwa might have been able to leverage his personal history with Abacha. But when he declined the ministerial offer, implying that he would continue to support the Ogoni resistance, Sariwa seemed to shut the door on that relationship.
And it's escalated because oil was the #1 revenue earner for Nigeria. And the way Abacha saw it, Sariwa and the Ogoni people wanted to damage the basis of the country's revenue, the reliance on oil. So Sariwa and Musab, whatever they were doing, became interpreted by the federal government as an insurgency movement, as undermining the interest of government, as undermining the interest of Shell.
On one hand, Sariwa might have been optimistic for an Ogoni victory after his meeting with Abacha, but his rejection of Abacha's offer also came from his deep mistrust for the government.
To deny a people the right to self-determination for well on 100 years is to subject them to slavery. To take away the resources of a people and refuse to give them anything in return is to subject them to slavery. To take away the land of a people who depend solely on land for their survival and refuse to pay them compensation is to subject them to genocide.
On the other hand, when it came to the Niger Delta, Abacha had only one priority: to secure his regime's hold over Nigeria's oil wealth. He wanted to expunge what his regime called the Mossop virus from the Niger Delta so that oil-related activities in the region would not be further disrupted. In May 1994, Abacha found an opportunity to act. He launched one of the most brutal, targeted repression campaigns in Nigeria's history. This crackdown would culminate on November 10, 1995, with the military execution of Sariwa and 8 other Ogoni activists. The execution became one of the largest crises of the Abacha regime, both domestically and internationally. It led to Time magazine labeling Abacha the Thug of the Year in 1995. More seriously, it led to Nigeria's suspension from the Commonwealth. But wait, our journey into the Niger Delta and Ken Sariwa's story has only just begun. Over the course of this season, we will look into Ken Sariwa's life, the Ogoni crisis, and the birth of Mossop, the trials and executions of the 9 Ogoni activists, the aftermath of these murders, and what meaning this dark historical moment has today, nearly 30 years on.
Good afternoon again to everyone. Thank you very much for taking the time to come out this afternoon. Thank you to the organizers of the Open Book Festival, to Mervyn, Frankie, Della, Carmen, the whole team. Thank you to all of you once again for making the time to attend this afternoon's conversation. I want to specifically highlight that my 4-month-old daughter is in the room. It's her first book festival. And she's a homebody, so to coax her out of the house, my wife and I had to tell her that I was going to be in conversation with Dr. Seuss. I'm sure at this point the penny has dropped, so Wale, no pressure, but she's...
I can rhyme. I can do a few rhymes. I'm going to do that on this.
Amazing. But in all seriousness, I mean, first of all, Wale, congratulations on what an incredible, raw, heavy, insightful podcast, which reflects the caliber of work that the Republic does. If you don't know who Wale... Yeah, absolutely. If you don't know who Wale Lawal is, he is the editor-in-chief of The Republic. The Republic is, I think, one of the most exciting publications on the continent. It's absolutely beautiful, but not only beautiful, It's replete with thoughtful essays and analyses on not only Nigerian politics and culture, but African politics and culture too. So very excited to have you here today, Wale. And I always feel excited when a Nigerian and a South African are in dialogue. For some reason, it always feels like we're making diplomatic advancements, you know? So it's fabulous to have you here. We don't have a lot of time, so I want to jump straight into conversation so that we can also have time for the audience to ask questions. And I suppose the first question I have for you is reflecting on what we just watched. You know, these events happened about 30 years ago today. And so the question is, you know, why, outside of just commemorating what happened, why now? Why make this podcast now? Why reflect on the life of Ken Saro-Wiwa? And for those in the audience who might not be entirely familiar with who he was, I think we caught a glimpse from those 10 minutes, but just maybe give us some more details about what was significant about this moment in Nigeria's history.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and I'll try and summarize things as quickly as possible. But first, thanks everyone for being here. I mean, you know, these are very heavy topics, so sometimes you often wonder if it's going to pull an audience, so I'm glad to see so many people in the room. In terms of just why, you know, why Ken Saro-Wiwa, why now? Ken Saro-Wiwa was a very interesting figure. You know, he was an activist, he was an environmentalist. But I think it's always, for me, you know, his story is an opportunity to kind of just show Nigerians what is possible or what a small group of Nigerians can do. I mean, I say small, but you know, the Ogonis at some point in their history, in 1993 in particular, staged one of the largest demonstrations that we've ever seen in Nigeria against the backdrop of probably the most repressive government that we've ever had. In 1993, there were about 500,000 Ogonis that we knew of based on the census. Over 300,000 of them showed up January, you know, to protest. That's 3 out of 5, you know, Ogonis. And you know, when you look at that and you compare that, that's 60% of people showing up and just participating politically. And when you look at that and you compare that to, let's say, our recent election, where we had voter participation of about 20-something%, it kind of just shows you, I guess, where we're coming from and the level of work that is needed in terms of just organizing. So for me, that's really the interest. As somebody who, you know, the Republic really came to be known during the NSAS protests. We were one of the very few publications that actually documented the protests from the beginning till the end. And I remember back then, you know, the comment that we kept getting was, this is the biggest protest we've ever seen. You know, young people are very fond of doing that. This is like the first time that Nigerians have ever done this. And I thought, you know, just looking back, I really thought, because now, I mean, you know, I always get a lot of criticism for this, but I don't really class the protests as successful because, you know, when you then look into whether the protest could sustain itself, become a movement and things like that, it didn't really happen. But it got a lot of attention, and I think protests are very good at doing that. But then the big question is, how does this then become a successful movement that can actually enact long-term change? So of course, you know, going back into history and just looking at some of the examples of protests that we've seen that made their way into becoming movements, the big question now became, what can we learn from that? And MOSUP, you know, the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, is a big example of that. And when you listen to the podcast, you really find that what we're really trying to do is understand how this movement could come up, sustain itself, could, you know, resist such a very brutal government. And, you know, they had their own fair or unfair share of repression, because as much as they were protesting, as much as they had figures like Ken Saro-Wiwa, the government was also actively repressing Ogonis as well. And this was a group of people, it's an ethnic minority, and if we have more time, we can talk about just this colonial invention of ethnic inequality in Nigeria. But they were an ethnic minority, and they found themselves, if you look back into Nigerian history, caught between the two competing groups during the Nigerian Civil War, so the Nigerian government itself and Biafra. So it's a very oil-rich region. So of course, everyone wants a piece of it. So you know, to kind of understand just the significance of this group that was really trying to assert itself, you have to look back into Nigerian history as well. You have to look at why many Ogonis were not necessarily in support of Biafra, because a lot of them were also repressed during Biafra. Many of them were, you know, forcibly conscripted into war. Many of the women were raped. Many kids were abducted. And so you have this group that has, you know, for a long time in Nigeria's independent history or post-colonial history, often just tried to assert itself, or at least tried to establish some sort of relationship with Nigeria that wasn't built on exploitation, that people had been exploited, their resources had been exploited. And I think the big message that we were really trying to pass with this podcast was, when we talk about neocolonization, when we talk about, you know, just how many post-colonial states evolved, we're often, I guess, you know, really focused on what is the US doing, what is the CIA doing, what is, you know, Europe doing, and not really looking at the ways in which that independence era or many, you know, post-colonial African states kind of just weaponized colonial instruments to their own advantage. And so this really helped us to really help people understand where we are coming from, why Nigeria is the way that it is, and what we can also learn. At some point in the podcast, we speak to ex-MOSOP members, and there's a big message that one of them, you know, said, Professor Ben Nanan, who's a professor at the University of Port Harcourt now, and he used to be an executive secretary at MOSOP. And he basically said that one thing that he really wishes that they had understood back then was that when they had that momentum, they should have looked into becoming a political party. He used the ANC as an example of that, the ways in which, you know, the ANC was able to transform itself into a political party. I know that this is South Africa and there's a lot of criticism that the ANC is, you know, is facing. But you have to also understand that for many people kind of just looking at how you can, you know, you have this movement that is for a group that, you know, that considers, that is marginalized. He thought that that's one thing that they should have done, that when that moment to seize political power happened, they should have formalized that process, as opposed to just, you know, leaving it as an NGO or things like that. And right now, MOSOP itself is in a leadership crisis. I mean, ex-leaders of MOSOP have been, you know, almost assassinated. They haven't been able to establish what their vision is for the Ogonis and for the future. And when I look back at NSAS, we're in a similar limbo where we've had this protest, but now what next? You know, some, you know, people are on the run. Some people who are pro-NSAS have now been, you know, conscripted into the government. You heard from Professor Toyin Falola about the activists who, you know, suddenly found themselves in government and is like, well, now I can't speak because I'm already eating. So we are repeating the mistakes that we saw in the past. But the thing is, we're only going to continue repeating those mistakes if we keep assuming that every movement and every protest we stage is new or is novel or has never happened or is unprecedented. So I think we you know, the podcast focused on Ken Saro-Wiwa to really bring that perspective to help people understand what it means to be Nigerian from a non-ethnic majority lens, but also what it means to try and run a movement and the level of work that's needed to sustain that, you know, over the years.
Right.
And what the high stakes are or how high those stakes are as well. So
Right.
those, I think, were the three major things that we were looking at in developing this.
Those are a set of striking conclusions, and I mean, it resonates with me because I work for a magazine called Africa as a Country, which you could think of kind of like the scruffy cousin of the Republic. And we just put out an issue which is on the mass decade of protests, which charts how between 2008, which is roughly the period of the global financial crisis, and 2025 really, we saw the biggest explosion of protests ever recorded in human history, right? Whether it's the Arab uprisings, whether it's, you know, Gezi Park, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall, whether it's End SARS, whether it's et cetera, and it feels like all of that is kind of reaching a crescendo in the current conjuncture with the global mobilization against the genocide in Palestine. And I think what you're saying now about how do we convert momentum and popular energy into a sustained effort at trying to transform society is a really pertinent question. And I think, you know, the point about political parties is interesting because in some places, including Nigeria, some people have tried to make initiatives at starting political parties, you know, Sowore with All Africa's People's Congress that came out of the Take It Back movement in 2011, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious to hear, you've already touched on it a little bit, but what was it about that moment where you feel like this, as you said, ethnically marginalized group of people in Nigerian society was able to mount such a fierce opposition to the dispossession of their land, and to do so using nonviolence, right, which was something that they emphasized in the early 1990s when it happened. And in our era of sort of mass communication and sort of mass publicization of events, how do you think we translate those lessons? If you could kind of specify what you think the particular kind of steps to doing so are.
I think that's a good question, and it's one I love to talk about, because it forces us to talk about what organization really looks like. I think that for a lot of people, organization is just getting together, making it trendy, just taking some cool pictures. I mean, protests are cool, right? So, but I think people don't realize just how much of unglamorous work is required when it comes to organizing. But at the same time, and this is speaking from a Nigerian perspective, Nigeria is notoriously insular. I think we share that with Americans.
And South Africans, might I add.
I actually think South Africa does a better job of, when you look at just how South Africa has been engaged in this discussion about Gaza and just, how we need to address, the genocide that Israel is committing there. That shows me a level of connection that Nigeria just doesn't necessarily allow itself to have. Nigeria has a lot of money, a lot of all these things, but we often deceive ourselves into thinking that our local issues are unique and that our local issues are isolated from the rest of the world. Whereas I think part of what this project is trying to do is situate that movement, that indigenous movement, that discussion about what it means for people to be dispossessed of their land, what it means for people to exert colonial power, even when they are black. What it means for them to weaponize colonial instruments of governance like ethnic inequality against a very federal, government in which only ethnic majorities have access. The main purpose of that is to show people that these issues that you're facing are very well connected to the issues that other people are facing in other countries. And I think that's what is sorely missing, helping people to understand or having people understand that these bridges exist. That, for example, one of the biggest, one of the biggest activists in Gaza, for example, is a half Nigerian. Was a half Nigerian back in the day, and not many people know that. But for me, it's really trying to help people understand that previously colonized people, marginalized people are very connected, and there are lessons that we can learn from the experiences of other, of other groups in other countries, even when those groups fail, right? So I'm always very interested in, in how movements fail. It's been like a very academic interest that I've had, because I think we tend to focus on successful movements, and oftentimes successful movements are, they're exceptional. They may not necessarily represent the full diversity of the kinds of movements that exist at any point in time. Failure tends to be very democratic. It's very accessible. You will find, it's true, you will find a wide range of groups. And so when we study African history, for example, and we say, anti-colonial movements were very, there's always this debate. Was it elite-led? Was it grassroots-led? Why are there so many men represented? And you start to look at the movements that didn't necessarily succeed, or you change the criteria of success. You then get to see so many different people, and there's so much wealth to learn from. I think the big thing is helping people understand, or the thing that's missing is people understanding that they are not necessarily alone, and they're not working in isolation, that there are all these groups working in other areas that you need to connect to. The second point that I wanted to make is why this was very important was the Ogoni movement was very international. And I think that the way in which it was international is another thing that we can learn from. Whenever I'm in the UK or in the US, there's always a big conversation with Africans in the diaspora about, what can we do to help Nigerians back home? And I'm always like, well, what can you do to help yourself? Because the diaspora is a very vulnerable space.
Right.
Very limited political representation. In the UK, for example, they're very notorious for changing immigration rules. One moment you're allowed to do this, another you're not allowed to do that. And my big question for them is, what happened to the African diaspora and how did it lose its organization. You have access to all that infrastructure. You talked about the fact that we have access to technology and all of these things, but just look at the diaspora. They have access to freedoms that you may not necessarily have on the continent. They have access to technology, incomes that you're not necessarily experiencing on the continent, and yet it is still fractured. So I think what movements like this help us understand, because for a long time, when many of the Ogonis were imprisoned in Nigeria, the movement was diaspora-led. You had people like Professor Ben Nanan, who was living in Switzerland or somewhere Nordic and was still mobilizing people and moving around, going to the Commonwealth. You had Ken Saro-Wiwa's son attending Commonwealth meetings, really trying to mobilize people to speak on behalf of the Ogonis. Nelson Mandela was a big voice, in that period. So many different international people, but somehow we've kind of lost that ability to just organize in that manner. And I think that organizing needs to be the big thing, not just organizing locally, but also organizing within the diaspora and then even between the diaspora and the continent itself. And I think that that's really what we were trying to get at, or what I think is needed or missing in conversations today.
Just on the point of diaspora, I feel like the new dynamic also is having sort of figureheads of the diaspora who are more reactionary than the governments in their home countries. So Kemi Badenoch, for example, who's sort of a rising Tory star in the United Kingdom. Who
we don't
need to.
Okay, we don't. She's not that.
That's,
I mean,
okay.
she said
okay.
it. She's not. She's
you have to claim her.
So,
we claim. We get Elon Musk. We have Elon Musk. So I feel like.
Okay, you know what? Fair enough.
You see,
fair enough.
Not that it's a competition.
Okay,
it doesn't always.
Exactly. She's denied us. So
has Elon. So
we
it's
said, if you're denying us, we agree. You're not one of us.
So I want to ask now a question. You've emphasized this point about organization, and I want to ask then about the Republic as a magazine. How do you, as a magazine, see your responsibility as a journal of ideas in these moments of organization? Because I think what's tough is that, in the throes of activism, in the throes of taking a stand against injustice and oppression, often people are acting based on, inherited political instincts. They're doing the best that they can in the moment. And often that means that there's no real time to take the long view, right? There's no real time to sort of look back in history for antecedents of when other people did something similar, to learn from failure, et cetera, right? People are kind of reacting. And so for a magazine like yours, which is about trying to kind of take that distance, right? How do you take that distance in a way that provokes people, that kind of still resonates with them, but that at the same time doesn't come off too aloof, right? It's I think the question about class and the class character of a lot of movement leaders during the anti-colonial period is very interesting, right? Because, one can't ignore the fact that, some of them, were quite from elite backgrounds. I didn't appreciate the full extent myself of Ken Saro-Wiwa's elite background, sort of living next door to General Abacha. And that the world generally of making ideas tends to be this sort of rarefied place that often isn't accessible to most people in the population, right? Most ordinary South Africans in this room with us right now, kind of having these conversations. So I'm just curious to first, if you can, quickly give us a 5-second, 10-second background into the Republic and what is your reason for being, but then also to hear more about how you guys place yourselves in these moments of upsurge, such as EndSARS, and how you relate to activism in a way that both engages people, but also is not afraid to challenge them.
Absolutely. I think, the long and short of the work that we do at the Republic is to challenge and inspire our readers. It's both. And we're guided, or our editorial is guided by two principles. The fact that we will always publish progressive ideas, but then also we will always champion independent thinking. We never want our readers to get too comfortable because the world isn't comfortable. There's so much that's changing and that we're unprepared for. But we think that it's our job to make sure that, readers who have to live their daily lives, go out into the world, might be distracted, have a place where they can find at least some sort of truth, right? And it goes back to the very founding of the Republic, which I started as a student. And I remember back then, or at least when I started thinking about it in 2013, we were all wrapped up in this idea of Africa rising. And I was just explaining to someone earlier that, I'm always telling people that I really feel like I was part of a cult back then, because I would go to all of these development conferences, I would go to all these development conferences, I was really, really, in Nigeria, we use the term washed. To the extent that, I had gone to school in the UK, my parents were like, look, you need to stay, get a passport, and then you can come back and do this thing. And I was like, no. And this was all happening in the context of, I had grown up reading The Economist. I remember they had the cover, in 2000, Africa, the hopeless continent. Then by 2013 or 2010, it had become Africa Rising. And then McKinsey had this report, Lions on the Move. And I was like, oh my God, I have to go back, I have to change things, I have to do all of these things. And my parents were just devastated because they were like, we have, invested so much into you for you to stay in the UK or go to another country and just make a better life for yourself. And you want to come back here? So I went back to Nigeria, and I remember in that time, many countries were rebasing their economies. Nigeria was doing that, Ghana was doing it, Kenya was doing it. And in Nigeria, our economy, doubled overnight. We went from $250 billion to over $500 billion in terms of just how the economy was calculated. If anyone understands how rebasing works, we were basically using the kind of outdated metrics from like the 90s to calculate the size of our economy. So we weren't really capturing things like technology, entertainment. And so the moment that we did that, the economy exploded. But as someone who had grown up in Nigeria, was often visiting Nigeria, lived in Nigeria, had family in Nigeria, I didn't necessarily see the impact of that growth.
Yeah.
People were still suffering, there was still a lot of poverty. And what that showed me was, okay, when the world talked about Nigeria, and I could imagine this for other African countries, right? When it was extremely bad, it wasn't accurate. But even the positive narratives were also not accurate. So you couldn't really make good decisions. You couldn't really understand what was happening. The reality tended to be distorted even when the stories were positive. And so I started the Republic back then as a student just to understand better what was going on. But I'd say like our mandate really changed in 2020 because the protests were happening. And I remember one of the editors on our team was like, should we cover the protests? We were getting a lot of comments from our audience being like, there's a whole national blackout about the protests. You guys claim to be all about progress. But I was like, we're academic. Like, we don't do journalism. Like, this involves going to the streets and speaking to protesters and doing all of those things. We don't really do that. We don't have the infrastructure for that. And then they were like, well, then that means that you guys are inauthentic. You've been lying to us. So we were like, okay, let's just publish, a few things on the protests, and let's help people understand, police brutality happening in a kind of global context. So people understand that, look, police brutality isn't just something new. It's tied to colonization. It's tied to global movements, around things like, abolishing prisons or just even reforming police generally. And then we did that, and it just went viral. It went viral to the point of us being picked up by Al Jazeera. They had a feature on us. And I think looking back at that time, I was like, okay, we've been doing this thing with academic work all this time, and it had gotten us a lot of prestige, it had gotten us, those types of things. But I think when we did that story, that was probably when we found our true calling, which was bringing that rigor to the lives of everyday people. So it wasn't just about, publish about an issue or talk about these big ideas, but it was also helping people understand how those ideas played out in reality. And so I think that for us, ever since, that has now been like the main thing that we're looking at. Just how can we continue to tell people stories, progressive stories about the lives that we live, championing independent thinking, but helping them understand how this affects them and how this plays out in their own lives. Because the moment we stop doing that, our audience immediately responds. And they're like, guys, you can't just keep talking about ideas. Like, shit, an idea, we go chop, that kind of thing. Like, you have to kind of show us how these ideas play out in our lives. Not all of us went to Oxford. Not all of us went to these schools. But we're all affected by these things. And it's urgent that you help us understand what is going on. So much of it, I can't sit here and claim that, we just had this brilliant idea to just suddenly talk about these things. It was literally the audience being like, guys, there's a big gap. If you claim to be this people, go and fill it. And so we started doing that. And I think that basically helped us to get the response that we've been getting over the years as well. I would say, in the corporate sense, I would say we got feedback and we incorporated that feedback.
I want to ask you one more question, and then we'll go to audience questions as well. Your flagship product is a print magazine.
Yes.
It's beautiful. It's available for sale. So afterwards, if you want to purchase a copy, find Wale. If you want to purchase copies of Africa as a Country as well, find them at the book lounge. And some people might be like, why would you make a print publication now in a world of fracturing attention spans, of large language models, of platform dominance, etc., etc.? So why do print?
That is a good question. And if we had more time, I would, go into my technology thesis. However,
we don't.
No,
please.
I won't. However, the main thing I will say is it's deceptively print, right? So it's deceptively print. For every essay that we feature in here, there's a QR code, and the goal is to really get people to our website. I talked about the evolutions that the Republic has gone through. One of those evolutions is also developing tech and technology and technological solutions. In about a month or so, we will be announcing a tool that we've been developing with some funding from Google that allows us to produce audio in African accents. But the way that we think about technology and the way that we think about even just AI is how can we use this to champion African creativity, African thinking in a way that supports Africans at the end of...
Nora agrees. My daughter agrees, which is great.
In a way that supports, Africans at the end of the day. And so for us, it still kind of boils down to our model right now, which is decentralized. We work a lot with freelancers. We're often thinking about how we can bring in more money and more income into kind of like the local ecosystem, and even with the technology products that we have. So when it comes to print, a future edition of this in fact, our latest edition of the magazine, which looks at technology, you can actually listen. You scan the QR codes to listen to the essays. And for us, print allowed us to stand out. We wanted to be the crazy people. Who are those crazy people doing print? Why are they doing print? And it makes people ask those questions. And I think that whenever we have conversations like this, it helps people to remember us. It's very good for branding. It's very good for experience. We wanted to produce journalism that wasn't just on a screen. We wanted people to experience it, to kind of feel like they could identify with it. I'm always telling people that you look at people holding certain magazines or certain journals, and you can almost tell their political beliefs. You see someone holding the New Yorker, you see somebody holding the Atlantic, you see someone holding the FT, and they're all different kinds of people. And so we were thinking, is there a Nigerian publication that you see people holding, and you can kind of just understand where they stand on certain issues? So we wanted to be that, and I think print allowed us to do that. But also it allowed us to penetrate the market in a way that maybe just being online would not have allowed us to do, because the Nigerian online media space is saturated. And it's still kind of lucrative. It's a declining market, sure, but you're looking at a market that's still worth about $100 million, right? So our big question there was, when you put us alongside the existing magazines, would we stand out? And if we could we then get enough attention from people in order to then just convert them to our website in the long term? So it's a very long-term play, but also we wanted to start with something that people were used to. It's some advice I got early on in building this, that innovation doesn't have to look flashy. It can also just look like something that you already know that's just presented better. And so we kind of follow that philosophy of presenting people with something that they knew, but just making it better and just making it, I guess, technology enabled, so that they would end up on our website and be on this long-term journey with us. So yes, it's print, but it's deceptive. The end goal is to get everybody in this room on our website at some point. But yeah, that's a thesis.
Thank you, Wale. We have a little bit of time for questions from the audience. So maybe what we can do is we probably only have time for, I want to say 3 or 4. So if you have a burning question, please put your hand up. A microphone will come to you. Let's take them all at once and then give Wale an opportunity to address them. So it's open. At the front here, I think, someone with the microphone. Okay, great.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
Talking about environmental injustices across Africa and whether you cover those, where are the biggest injustices taking place in Africa, and are the activists making any headway in their activism? I'm a journalist. I've just come back from Mpumalanga, where 1.7 million people are the sacrifice zone for electricity production in our country. So I'd love to know, where are we winning in Africa? Where are we really losing?
Thank you. So you wanted us to take... Yeah, let's take them all at once and then you can respond to them. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I have a very quick question around the podcast itself and around access to the archives. I'm really curious about how continental actors access archives, especially from particularly repressive regimes, and what that process looks like, whether it's possible, and yeah, your experience of that. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Philippa. There's so many layers to this whole conversation, but I think for me, one of the things you started saying was, how do you tell the story of how people organize? So there's something about you telling the story that must kind of help us understand, and there was the longevity, where we've come from, where we're going, and how we connect beyond our locality. And there's always been this thing of the hero's journey. And I think that is a colonial construct in some ways, and it divides us, and there's something else about telling a story that is, you spoke about all the people who have contributed. Is that something you're trying to do, and how are you telling those stories? Like a piece of jazz, or like, how do you do that? Because I think this, yeah.
That's a good question. So the question about the hero's journey. So we have environmental justice, archives, hero's journey.
Maybe we can take one more. Yeah.
Okay. Hello. Hi, my name is Adirin Sola. My question is about AI. I'm interested to know in what ways AI is going to inform the direction that Republic takes, and how you're contending with the ethical implications that we now all have to, because society is being reorganized around it, and people are urging and showing us kind of the destruction that's happening as a result of it. So I'm interested to hear how it's informing the journey and what considerations you're also taking.
All right, sure. So that's a question about AI. So we've got environmental injustice, archives, hero's journey, and then AI. Just a note on AI, I'm going to be on a panel on the 7th, and that panel is about AI, so I will talk a bit more about our work there, but I will still answer your question, or at least attempt to. So on the first question with environmental injustice, I think for me, some of the biggest issues around that we've kind of been seeing and monitoring is this, I think, new era of what they call greenwashing. I've been very interested in particularly the Gulf states, which have been buying land in East Africa in particular to offset their carbon emissions. That's one big area that I'm interested in. Because, as you can imagine, many African governments just, we're in this, what we call this new scramble for Africa. And there are ways in which African countries are participating, and whether they're participating in wise ways or foolish ways, I think, is up for debate. I think we all know the answer, but given the kind of leaders that we have. But I think I'm very interested in this idea of, buying up land, as a means of offsetting your own carbon emissions. Of course, we know that Africa is disproportionately, has disproportionately contributed in terms of greenhouse gases. We have very low emissions, right? And many governments often use that as an excuse to pollute more. And so have also seen these deals as a way of bringing in income, but also justifying the fact that, look, we haven't had a chance to pollute the earth as much as you guys, so we're going to do that anyway. So there's that. But then the big question is, where is this land coming from? Who's being dispossessed to make this land available? And so there's a lot of those questions, that are still kind of unresolved. I think another area that, that is very interesting. I mean, I'm very, mixed when it comes to whether we're winning or we're losing here. But I think a big area is looking at Gabon. So a couple of years ago, Gabon became, I think, the first country in the world to be paid to preserve its forests. So most people, if anyone knows, Gabon has like the second largest carbon sink. So they're a net negative carbon producer. So they don't actually produce greenhouse gases. They absorb a lot more on the net. And so they've been paid by, I think it's a Nordic country, I can't remember which one now, but they were paid over $100 million, and I think it's an annual deal or something like that, to preserve their forests. again, I'm very curious as to the behind the scenes of that and just how does that actually play out? How does another country fund the production or the preservation of your forests? And I remember from some research that I did into Gabon, not everybody in Gabon, agrees with this emphasis on environmental preservation. There's people who complain about elephants storming into their, from those types of complaints to the lack of availability of jobs just because of just how tightly regulated forestry is there. So I guess there's that as well. So on some level, some people count that as a win. Oh, we're able to attract money for preserving our forests. But on the other hand, where does that money go to? We all know the story of Gabon, the recent coup, just how concentrated all that wealth is at the top. So they're getting all that money, but is it really spreading? That's a big question. So I'd say those are the two key things that I've been kind of really interested in. Gabon's kind of like carbon miracle, if you want to call it that, and then the other being this idea of greenwashing and how many countries are just buying up land in many African countries to offset their own carbon emissions. I think that's really a big area. And of course, what's happening in Nigeria, the fact that Shell, has divested their onshore assets, selling it off to local players. But also, I think a big story that we focus on, or a big thing that we focus on the podcast is when people look at Shell, we call them IOCs, so international oil companies. But the thing to know about a lot of these companies is that they are often majority owned by the Nigerian government. So when people say Shell is polluting Nigeria and devastating Nigeria, it's actually the Nigerian government doing that. And that's the reason why Shell would not want to pay fully to account for those things, because it's like they're already paying taxes. They already have to share the profits. Why should they have to pay for that? But then there's been a landmark ruling in the UK that will now allow Shell to be tried on these cases. So I think Shell is a big, big area that people are not speaking enough about. And just the fact that, you're looking at an Ogoni crisis that has been going on for over 30 years with very little accountability. Oil is still a very big, big area that has been devastating the environment, particularly in Nigeria, that is still not really talked about enough, especially the involvement of the Nigerian government in that whole process. Even down to the cleanup. So there's been a whole $1 billion cleanup exercise, but even from the podcast, when we spoke to people, the cleanup exercise hasn't really been going anywhere. It has just become like a political position. The next question, which was about archives, if you've done research into this continent, I think you already know the answer to that. It's very, very difficult. It's very hard. We're often having to rely on a mix of local archives, but also international archives. And I think one of the big things that we learn when we study African history is just how to engage with archives, right? Whether we're going to be looking at them along the grain, against the grain, how to just really understand the context of what is going on. How can you tell an authentic African story when you have to rely on Western sources that may not necessarily want to present you in the best light? So that's where we then have to negotiate between what to read along the grain or what to read against the grain. But I think with us, what we did that was, I think, very interesting was we worked with, we had a very strong research team. And the first thing that we did was really speak to many experts. We spoke to close to about 20 different people, trying to just really understand the oral history of what is going on. We were speaking to professors, we were speaking to activists who could point us to their own sources of material. And oftentimes they were able to give us those sources, for free, because of course the podcast is free. It's open, it's open knowledge, it's open source. So there was a lot of that. There was a lot of relying on existing networks, relying on existing academic networks, because the actual physical archives are not in a good state. I did go to Port Harcourt, I did go to the Wheatfield Foundation, and they've preserved, a lot of things really well. And I think it's really a case-by-case basis. I don't think that there's any rule that I can tease out from the work that we did here, because I'm sure that when we have to do another story, it'll be a very different set of issues that we will face. But I think it was all about triangulating, from interview sources to our own kind of local archives, those that were available, to also Western archives as well, and just knowing how to negotiate in each of those areas. But I'm also very open to outlining when there's a big gap. So when you listen to the podcast, you will find that there are areas where I say that we couldn't do this, we couldn't do that. And the reason we do that is for anyone else that's out there that's interested in a topic like this and has, and can actually tackle or has the space or resources to do that, to also contribute to that body of knowledge. So there's many gaps that are still left unfilled, but that's the nature of storytelling. The third question was about the hero's journey. I completely agree. I don't think that we should be putting out narratives that try and assume that one person was directly responsible for any kind of social progress. It is impossible. I think that this is framed around Ken Saro-Wiwa because he's a recognizable figure. He's a figure that we can use as an entry point, but it's really a story about a movement. And in fact, when you listen to episode 3, that's, to me, one of my favorite episodes, because we get to focus on, the under-discussed aspects of the Ogoni movement. So for example, we focus on the women's movement, and we meet, in that episode, we meet a professor in Canada who's written a book on the contributions of Ogoni women to the movement. And what we get to understand, from her work is just how, number one, underreported it is. She's probably like the first historian to properly document, this movement. I'm trying to remember her name, so I'm stalling, but I hope I remember her name by the end of this. But she gets to really document, this movement, showing how young people, young women in particular, were able to sustain the movement. Because as you can imagine, many, of the people who got arrested during protests were men. But of course, she also writes about how, rape was used as a weapon of force, but also the different motivations that women had to get into the movement. I talked earlier about 300,000 people participating in the movement. And, for many people that we spoke to, their first introduction to an Ogoni protest was through their mothers. So their mothers would go there, they would take them along with them, and women had a special interest in pushing against oil extraction, because in Ogoni land, women are the farmers. So if they can't farm, if they can't, actually extract, or get materials from the soil, then there's no livelihood. So many of them had a personal connection, a deep connection to the protest. And it's a very, very complicated set of organizations that they set up. It was called FOA, that they set up to resist or to even just participate in the movement. And that movement still exists, till this day. The final question was around...
Can we actually leave the AI question for your panel? So we ended on a cliffhanger as an excuse for you to have to go and attend that panel. It's 5 o'clock on the dot. So
we can do that.
Is that okay? Sorry, it's okay. Wale and all of you, thank you for your brilliant questions.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us to talk about the Republic.
Absolutely.
A reminder, you can listen to this podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. Make sure to purchase an issue of the Republic outside, subscribe online, and support the incredible work that they're doing. So, Wale, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. A reminder that he's speaking on how many more panels this weekend?
Just one more.
Just one more, okay. And that is on?
The 7th.
The 7th. At what time?
Oh, that's a good one. I've actually forgotten.
ChatGPT, when is that?
But I did want to say, for the professor to look at who studies Ogoni women, her name is Domale Dube-Keys, and she teaches at the University of Alberta. It's very important that I never forget names, so I don't know what happened there, but Dr. Domale Dube-Keys, really fascinating, fantastic work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wale.
Yeah, thank you. This was really great.
And thank all of you. Please support the Open Books Festival this weekend. Go to other events, other talks, and see you at the next one. Thank you. Oh. I think I... Oh, yeah.
Did we not? We didn't do that?
I did. I'm Will Shoki from Africa as a Country. We had to introduce my ancestors, then we'll be here until tomorrow. So we can keep it moving along, but yeah, that's who I am. Thank you, everyone, for coming this afternoon.
Thank you so much.